And you were live.
Good morning, everyone. It's the one, the only Senor Silverback himself, joined by the master of the flux capacitor, and our special guest today, because of all the mayhem in the UK, none other than the man himself, London Paul, on another Rogue Money Mornings. You can follow us on Twitter at The Rogue Money. Check us out on Facebook, Rogue Money, and RogueMoney.net. And also check out the Apple News app. We're there, and iTunes, as well as the Google Play Music. You can find our podcast pretty much anywhere podcast apps are distributed. With that being said, also, guys, check out myfreedomnow.us, myfreedomnow.us. Get the credit score you deserve, get out of debt, or if your credit is fine, you just want funding for investments and or pet projects, or you just like to have money to do whatever the heck you want with, check out myfreedomnow.us. Let these guys give you up to $600,000 unsecured. Go out there and check it out, myfreedomnow.us. With that being said, CJ, London, Paul, wow, what an evening, what a night it was.
Well, good morning to everybody, and afternoon, or wherever else you are. Yeah, I mean, to put it in context, when Theresa May announced this election, she didn't have to do it, but she felt there was pressure on the Conservative Party to get this Brexit vote through, or any negotiations. So she thought, oh well, the Labour Party's in disarray. That's the major opposition party, and we can easily secure a 50 or even 100-seat majority. And even a week ago, there was a lot of talk about that. Now, of course, what subsequently happened is they were a government with a very small majority, and now they're a government that has no majority. So therefore, it's what's called a hung parliament. Now, I'll explain briefly how the UK parliamentary system works. We have 650 MPs, which is for obviously England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. Now, each of those MPs represents a constituency. So, and that's normally, geographically, it's kind of spread. So they get an even spread of number of people who live in these constituencies. So in rural areas, geographically, it's a lot bigger, and inner city areas, it's a lot small. Now, what actually obviously happened is this, because it's 650 seats, to be an outright government, you need 326 seats to have a majority. Now, there's one seat left which is outstanding, which I think it's because they've got to do a recount, because everything here is paper ballots, by the way. We don't have electronic machines, so they have to do the counting, and if it's very close, they do 2 or 3 recounts. But notwithstanding, the Conservatives got 318 seats, which means even if they win the one outstanding, they're going to be 7 short of a majority. So obviously it's a hung parliament. So therefore, on that basis, they have to then look as the major party to try and form a coalition government. This happened in 2010, the same problem, and they formed one with a party called the Liberal Democrats. Now, the minor parties of the Scottish National Party, who are never going to want to form a government with the Conservatives. The Liberal Democrats have already said no, not again, because the Scottish National Party ended up, well, their vote got decimated, but that's a separate matter we'll come to. They got 35 seats and the Liberal Democrats got 12. So if you add those figures, it goes over the 326. However, the only candidate likely, and from what I understand it will happen, there's a party in Northern Ireland called the Democratic Unionist Party who got 10 seats. So if you add the 318, even if they don't get the extra one, they'll have 328 seats, which means they've just got a majority. But then, what amount of horse trading has to go on with these minor parties to, what concessions do they want in terms of voting with the government? Because obviously the risk is, if you have parliamentary votes, if you don't have a majority, then the government could keep losing the vote and never be able to pass any legislation. Right. So that is hugely complicated in itself. The DUP are likely to be very sympathetic to the government, so they might be able to help, but bearing in mind that Theresa May has gone from being an outright government as a party to now having to have a coalition and having an even smaller majority even with the coalition than they had, it's a complete disaster. And how she's actually said, oh, we're now going to a period of stability and everyone needs to calm down. Well, I mean, it's probably the worst electoral result I know in my lifetime, in terms, because you didn't have to call the election. I mean, which is only 2 years into a 5-year term. So we are allowed to do that in the UK. You can call election whenever you like. So it's an utter disaster in that respect. From the Labour Party's perspective, they got 29 more seats, but what's interesting is it wasn't a big transfer of votes from the Conservatives to Labour in terms of why Labour got more seats. What actually seems to have happened is that a lot more people have come out and voted overall. Normally people are very apathetic with elections here, but I think it's around 70% turnout, which is pretty high. And in that respect, Labour got an extra 10%. That's why they started to win seats from the Conservatives, but the Conservatives actually increased their vote as well. So at times Labour won seats, which was as a result of increasing their vote, and not because the Conservative vote was decreasing. I mean, the weird thing is in Scotland, they never vote for Conservatives ever. And yet the Conservatives have now got 13 seats in Scotland, which helped to decimate the Scottish National Party's vote. But I think this is because Nicola Sturgeon was very hell-bent on saying, well, we want Scottish independence, but want to stay part of the EU. And I think the Scottish people have voted with their feet and said, no, we're not having that. Mm-hmm. So that's the kind of the very gist of it. Now, strangely, what happens in this country is, even though it's a hung parliament and the Conservatives don't have the mandate to form a government in the sense of being a majority party, Theresa May still has gone to see the Queen, and she has to go and see the Queen, and ask permission to form a government. And I've got this vision in my head where I'd love it if she turned up and the Queen went, no, one cannot form a government. Can you imagine? Absolutely ridiculous. But in theory, that's what the Queen can do. She can go, no, but it's normally just a bureaucratic formal process. So they'll form a government, then they've got to form this coalition. But in reality, it's a complete mess. And what we saw immediately is the pound crash against the dollar. It dropped about 3 cents. I think it's recovered slightly. But what's perverse about that is that the pound crashed against the dollar because of Brexit last year. And yet people are now saying, well, because of this vote, it puts the whole Brexit process under a cloud. So what happens again? It crashes because Brexit happens. And then when Brexit becomes a doubt, the dollar crashes, pound crashes again. So it makes absolutely no sense. Now, the reality is that people think this is what's going to happen. Well, it doesn't matter one way or the other. If Brexit collapses, the European Union is going to collapse, and by default, the UK will leave the European Union because the European Union won't exist. But of course, what people probably largely overlooking is Corbyn, who's the Labour leader, has already said, we're supportive of the Brexit process. We just don't agree the way the Conservatives want to handle it, which is a bit more hard-nosed. And there's this hard Brexit and soft Brexit, and in some way, the Conservatives were almost at the point before the election so confident they'd win. There was almost like a thermonuclear Brexit approach. But I don't think Brexit will necessarily derail. It might do. I mean, unlikely, but even if it does, it doesn't matter, because ultimately the end goal will be that the UK leaves the European Union, whether it's Brexit or because the European Union collapses. So that's the kind of gist. So it's not entirely surprising it's happened. I think and we have exit polls like everywhere else, and they actually turned out to be, for once, fairly accurate. In the past, we've had situations where they were so inaccurate. I think it was back in 1992, they thought the Labour government, or the Labour would win, and of course they didn't. So, but they were pretty accurate last night, and it was obvious within probably an hour or two of the results starting to come out that it would be this hung parliament. But it's an utter disaster for the Conservative Party. And the question, though, is, and here's the problem: if Theresa May ultimately has to go and leave office and is forced into it, which there is a possibility, the kind of favourite to replace is Boris Johnson, who's the Foreign Secretary. And frankly, if he becomes Prime Minister, I'd be slightly concerned, to put it mildly.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that guy's a neocon nut job.
I mean, so it's going to be slightly concerning as to whether that happens. I mean, they kind of interviewed him, and he wasn't committing himself to May going forward, and they asked him about the leadership. I mean, he's definitely been angling to be the leader for a long time now. Interestingly, of course, we had UKIP, which was Farage's party, which got absolutely decimated. I mean, he's long since left the party. I mean, it didn't have any MPs, but its vote just collapsed and yesterday. Now, he's interestingly come out and talked about re-entering the political fold in the UK. Now, it's clearly obvious he's not going to hook up with UKIP again, I'd file this under speculation and rumour, and it might never come to pass, but I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, you can't become Prime Minister unless you're elected as an MP, so we've just had the election, but there might be, for example, a by-election, and for a single MP, and he could be somehow shoehorned in. I'm not saying this is going to happen now, but it could happen some point in the future, and I wouldn't rule out at some point in the future he could be a Prime Minister for the Conservative Party. I'm not saying it'll happen, and I've got no evidence to suggest that, but that's a possibility. But the problem is the Conservatives have is they don't really have anyone who appeals to people in general. I mean, yeah, they've got 300 and odd seats, 318 seats, and they've got this hardcore following, but it seems increasingly the demographic in the UK is that people under 30, a lot of them are just turned away from them and voting Labour. So when you have an ageing population, they need to reassess their priorities if they want to,
Let me ask you this,
be
Paul.
seriously considered in the future.
Are the young millennials in the UK just as dim-witted and as lost as the ones and their counterparts in the United States?
I think the problem is a lot of them are very idealistic. It's like they want to be all encompassing and to love everybody in the planet, which is a nice ideology in one sense, but because of that, they regard the European Union as being this wonderful thing where everyone unites and is integrated without understanding the politics behind it. So yeah, I mean, to varying degrees, the whole millennials thing is very similar wherever you go, Europe or the US, but not quite the same. They're not like politically extreme views like you have in the US, but they certainly have an idealistic view and see the world. It's like, Corbyn came out with these wonderful policies. They're very laudable. Don't get me wrong. But when you start to stack up and go, well, how are you going to pay for all this? I mean, a great example is, years ago, I mean, in my student days, you didn't pay student fees. And for people whose parents were particularly poor, you could get means-tested grants to supplement your student days. So people didn't run at massive debt. Of course, the world's changed, and now everybody here has to pay huge amounts of tuition fees on a yearly basis. Hence, they have to have student loans like they do in the US. Now, just to throw a figure in the air, if you say, and there's considerably more than this, but just to keep the math simple, if there was 1 million students in the UK going to university every year, and they paid £9,000 each per year for tuition fees, you're talking £9 billion a year would have to be found if students stop paying their tuition fees, which is what Corbyn suggested. So you go, okay, well, that's just one example. There's probably 2 million, I think, students. So let's say, okay, 18 billion. You start to stack up. Where's the money coming from to pay? Great. Students don't end up with massive debt when they leave university, but who's going to pay for these tuition fees? Who's going to pay for the improvements in the health service and healthcare in general, and the education and everything else he's proposing? And someone pointed out to me and said, well, this big panel of over 100 economists have all, vouched for what Corbyn's doing. And I just said, well, yeah, but what were these 100 and odd economists saying in 2008 before the world fell off its axis? I didn't hear any of them saying there was a problem.
Exactly.
so it really doesn't matter. But yeah, it will be interesting to see, without labouring the point too much, whether May survives or doesn't and is replaced. Who replaces it could be hugely interesting. I mean, if Johnson takes over, it'll take a lot of heat off Trump, I'll tell you that. because he'll even though it's the UK, he'll command a lot of interest just because of the things he said. I mean, he's already upset enough people as the foreign secretary. So I don't know what's going to happen, but I wouldn't be surprised if the whole thing just collapses. And I'm not saying it will happen, but I wouldn't even be surprised if we end up with another election in October, November time. And then the question then is, what's going to happen? Do people continue to vote for a hung parliament, or do we actually get an outright majority? But yeah, politically, it's an utter embarrassment for the Conservative Party. And I have to state to everybody, I'm completely a political party atheist. I've never voted for a single party in my life, and until the world changes, I've got no intention of doing so. I mean, I voted in the Brexit vote, and I voted to leave the European Union because it was the one time I thought there was something worth voting for. Political parties, as we all know, are an illusion. Okay, the world's changing in the US, but in the UK, it's still largely, it doesn't matter who you vote for, you get the same government. So, but in that regard, we'll have to wait and see. But yes, it's certainly, I mean, it wasn't as cataclysmic as Corbyn maybe winning, because I don't know what the pound would have done then. It probably would have completely collapsed. Stock markets would have had an epileptic fit and fallen about 500 points. God knows what else. But I mean, obviously that didn't happen. But we wait and see as things unfold. But certainly it's very damaging, and it really puts the Conservatives, they look like absolute idiots for calling an election, which they never needed to do so.
What a total folly on their part. I mean, they look like it's one thing to do it when you need it, but just to do it and think with such hubris that they had this in the, they have this in their back pocket, and to have it just blown up in their face, it's incredible, man. It's so funny to see it.
Well, I mean, the thing you could tell that they really thought they'd won is they brought out their manifesto, and some of the policies they came. I remember hearing and thinking, do you not realize how much of a negative dent that is in people wanting to vote for you? I mean, they had these tax, where they called it a dementia tax, where while people are alive, they won't they won't like penalise them, but if they've got more than so much money, if they don't just sell the house when someone dies and take all the money. I mean, just absolutely insane policies that were so unpopular. And of course, the one thing the Conservative government have done is they're very hot on austerity. They've made cuts everywhere, which have been deeply unpopular. And they just carried on that theme. And you could see that their arrogance was, well, we've got this home and hosed. Corbyn's is a nobody. We'll win by 100 seats, and then we can railroad everything through. Well, that's gone now. And but yeah, it is arrogance and stupidity that's probably the main reason for their downfall. And also underestimating, whilst Corbyn's not popular with the rank and file inside his political party, and he's not liked by the Conservatives or anyone else, he is popular with people, and they underestimated that. Whether Corbyn's ideals are just not workable is an entirely different matter, but he was popular with people, and there was a swing. 10% increase in votes is nothing to be sniffed at. I mean, they're claiming this moral victory, Corbyn, but I don't see it like that. But the chances are, if they do have another election pretty soon, you might see Labour win another 40, 50, 60 seats, and then all of a sudden it gets very interesting. So, but as they stand, they're themselves, they're nearly 65 seats from getting a majority themselves. I mean, even if they had another election in November, they're not really ever going to become the majority party. I mean, they've got a hell of a swing in that respect to achieve that aim, but they have certainly shown some improvement. But he's so unpopular. He's rather like Trump was to the Republicans. Corbyn is to his own Labour Party. I mean, he's not popular amongst them because he does have some pretty radical views, and he has come out with some, like he said he was going to confront, if he was ever elected, he'd confront Saudi over their terrorism. Can you imagine a British Prime Minister doing that? I mean,
no, especially they helped set up the Kingdom of Saudi.
Yes, exactly. But yeah, I think that's probably all we can. I mean, yeah, we could go on forever, but I think we've probably said enough about the UK election.
Hey, Paul, real quick, and I apologize if I missed it, but how does the vote impact Brexit?
Yeah.
Well, in reality, like I said, in a sense, it doesn't, because people always think that Corbyn was very anti-Brexit, and he wasn't. He's made the point that he doesn't agree with the Conservatives' kind of hard Brexit approach. He's more of a soft Brexit approach. Now, of course, that is potentially could start to influence the process a little bit more. It's hard to say in that regard. So it might be, because I think, as I said, it got to the point where I think Theresa May before the election was so confident of this 100-seat or whatever majority, she was saying, well, literally, let's have a thermonuclear approach. We'll just tell the EU to go away, and we're not even going to negotiate a deal. We'll just leave. Well, that's certainly not going to happen now. So it might be a more softer approach. It may be more drawn out, and it may lead the Conservatives to go, well, we're in a worse position now because we called the election early to try and get a bigger majority to railroad our policies through over Brexit. We're even in a weaker position. So do they risk having to drag this out, and it'll be a really slow process that doesn't take 2, 3, 4 years? But in the process, if it takes 2 years, within 2 years, the European Union is very likely not to even exist, as it does now as a Brussels diktat. The European nations will certainly exist still. They'll trade together. They just won't be under the duress of Brussels anymore. So, yeah, in that sense, it remains to be seen. But do the Conservatives risk going, well, let's have another election, and then they might actually lose? I mean, you just don't know. So they're in a very difficult position. But I think the hard-nosed edge to the Brexit approach is certainly going to fall flat on its face. And they're probably going to have to go with a more softly approach, which will really please the Brussels. I mean, I think they're probably really happy to see the Conservatives fall flat on their face in this election. But you just don't know it. I mean, it depends from Corbyn's stance exactly what he means. He wants a more kind of reflective view of how we leave the European Union. It might strike a bit of balance, but the chances are by the time they decide to do anything, the European Union won't exist anymore. So in which case it largely takes the hands out of the equation in terms of what needs to be done. But yeah, I certainly think the hard-nosed approach is over. They're not going to be able to do that now.
Excellent.
Unreal. Well, it's a comedy show, man. It really is.
Well, politics is. It's just grand theatre with on a level of. I mean, it is utter stupidity. I'm sorry to say, but I've only ever in my life met one parliamentary member who I won't mention his name because no one will know who he is, but he was one of the most intelligent, articulate, passionate guys. Yeah. He really did his job well. He represents his constituents. He's been an MP for decades, and he joined the Blair government in '97. And when he's tried to point out to Blair some of the failings in the department he's working at, he was quickly booted out, and that was it. But he's probably the only person I've ever met who I really had a load of respect because he actually does his job and he tries to be a representative for the people in his constituency. But apart from that, and particularly nowadays, rather probably like the US, they're just career politicians looking to make a name for themselves, make some money, establish some credentials so they can get a nice fat pension out the parliamentary system and go off and do some other things, make loads of money. And they're not interested in the parliamentary, and they don't care whether the UK does something overseas they shouldn't be doing, or the government's doing something it shouldn't be doing. They're not interested because it's a gravy train they don't want to get off.
Absolutely, man. It's like that book by Peter Schweitzer. I recommend everybody get it. It's called. You can get it on Amazon. It's on Kindle for I think for like $9. Hardcover you get it for like around $6 or $20, something like that. It's called Extortion. It's how politicians extract your money, buy votes, and line their own pockets. And a lot of people, and this guy spent a great deal of research, studying lobbyists, studying the politicians, and everybody's so quick to say, hey, you know what? It's the lobbyists, the lobbyists, the lobbyists, and that's what makes it DC so corrupt. No, it's the friggin' politicians. They literally go to DC, and their time there, from the moment that they're there to the moment that they leave, is constantly trying to raise money in order for them to get reelected. Their entire life is spent fundraising. That's how these lobbyists are there to begin with. The lobbyists are a symptom of a much greater problem. Is these career politicians, and that's the same thing that's happening in Western governments throughout the world. These people are there. They're not looking for your interest. That's why there has to be strict term limits. That you can only run twice, as a congressman, as a senator, as an MP, or whatever the terms are over there across the pond where you are, Paul. But
here you can be an MP for. I mean, there has been in the past, less so now. I think the revolving door tends to swing more, but there are people who've been MPs for 30, 40 years.
Yeah.
I mean, they re-elected it because there's only a certain number of swing constituencies in the UK. There's the hardcore who'll always vote Conservative, and there's a hardcore that will always vote Labour. And you've maybe got 100 seats in the middle that determine who becomes, the next government and who doesn't. I mean, it literally is that. And a consequence of that, the ones on the hardcore edge of Labour and Conservative could just sit there, become an MP, and not do an awful lot, and just get their money every year and get a big fat pension at the end of it, and and whatever other business links or however else they've got their snouts in the trough, so to speak, and that's how it works. And very sadly, that's why we have huge problems, and we need. And the day I vote is the day we have real political parties who have an interest in the well-being of the people of the nation. But apart from that, I don't see the point, because all I'm doing is, it doesn't matter who I vote for, because ultimately what changes in government policy? Absolutely nothing. I mean, people think it does, and they go, oh, well, this changed and this changed. But the real core element never changes. That's all the fluffy dice that people think means change, and none of it does. It's just to convince people that you live in a democracy and you get this freedom of choice. And in fact, you don't. It doesn't make any difference. So that's why I've got no interest in that respect in party politics, and why I never watch the news, and I'm never interested to hear what an MP has to say, because it's pointless.
Yeah, exactly. With that being said, I think we've covered what we need to cover. CJ, is there anything you want to go into?
No, nope. That's it as far as the vote. So I appreciate Paul breaking that down for us.
Paul, thank you so much. And CJ, I think we'll cover the rest of the topics on the evening show today.
Sounds great.
Awesome. Thank you, Paul. Thank you so much for coming on.
Oh, no, it's a pleasure. No, I would have been even... Yeah, it would have even been more interesting if Corbyn had won. I mean,
oh my
part
God.
of me was kind of sat there going...
Theresa May would have soiled herself.
I mean, she's obviously extremely unhappy, and but
She's
yeah,
so stupid. She didn't have to form a new government. She didn't have to have a new election. She wanted one, and it blew up in her face.
Well, I think it's just. I mean, I think what's happened is symptomatic that the whole political system's in total chaos, and I think the old days, even when we have these structured political parties, that they're changing, and things are not, going to be the way they are in the future. And obviously, ultimately, when the world changes, we'll have a different political system, whether it's in the US, UK, or anywhere else. But these people are like dinosaurs. They're living in the dark ages, and they think the world thinks the same way, and the world's moving on. And it's ironic, of course, people talk about millennials and malign them a great way, but actually the way they try to manipulate them in terms of the deep state cabal, everything is blown up in their face completely, because they're not thinking the way they want them to think. It's like in this country, when you have all this terrorism, and none of them want to fight, none of them want to get into an argument. They just want, let's all be friends and get on in life. Now, it's a very idealistic approach, but the cabal's idea of stoking all this anger in people in that generation's failed. It's completely failed, because they don't want to. If we had World War II today, the under 25s and 30s in the UK just go, I'm not fighting. What the hell are you talking about? They just wouldn't do it. Well, some of them would, but the majority of them would refuse. And that's where their ideology of trying to control people, and to some extent, yes, they have had a very bad influence over people of that generation, but in many ways it's blown up in their face equally, and it's not working how they wanted it to. Yeah. And that applies to the political system, which is why you do see votes and results coming out that they don't expect to happen.
Yeah, exactly correct, man. And I mean, look at the response from the Manchester bombing. They had a concert, and in that concert, you had that idiot Pop-Tart Ariana Grande singing a song about ejaculation and sex to a bunch of little girls. And their whole theme of the concert was, let's not be angry. Let's just move on from being angry. I mean, how stupid. I mean, people were like, you had 22 kids that were blown up, and their response is, let's not be angry. Let's just, let's just talk about just disgusting.
Well, and of course, but that's why it's kind of, it is that, I mean, they're trying to foment the anger in people to have civil disobedience, which then gives them the excuse to go, well, we can't tolerate this. We'll have to have introduced draconian measures to control people. And that's not working. Right. And they've tried it. I mean, they tried it in the US. They've had all these kind of idea to try and, instigate gun confiscation, every excuse known to man, and people haven't risen to the bait, and it's blown up in their face. And then they're further from gun confiscation than they've ever been. And with Trump, it's not going to happen at all. But the aim was to rile people, get them angry, and then they'd have an excuse to say, well, now we're going to have to confiscate guns. Now but this idea that just randomly they can go, well, we're going to implement martial law. If you did that in this country, people would go, hang on a minute, why? For what reason? But if everyone's rioting and people are living in their homes in fear and panic, then people are going to go, please bring in martial law and stop all these idiots and insane people running the street, running amok and wrecking our lives. But that's the whole purpose of it. But so there is the balance between taking a completely ambivalent attitude, who cares about this and nobody, but equally there's the extreme on the other end. There's don't, again, we've talked about this before, don't stoke the embers and start doing the very things they want you to do. But there needs to be the middle ground that says, not Theresa May's enough's enough, but something needs to be done. There needs to be a coordinated approach. I mean, Russia have been pushing this really hard with Western nations about counter-terrorism measures and adopting a global approach to dealing with the problem, dealing with it properly. And that's what needs to be done. There needs to be a proper concerted political effort. But there's no, you and I taking matters into our own hands is not going to do anything. It'll just make things a million times worse. And that's precisely what they want us to do. But you're right, having this, well, these awful things happen in the world and let's just all forget about it and pretend it doesn't happen. Then it happens again and again, is equally the completely wrong attitude. And people's ambivalence to serious matters allows the political system as it is to get away with it. And that's why they've got away with things for so long, because everyone has been ambivalent and disinterested or not even known it's happening. And of course, now the world is changing and people are coming more awake to what's going on. People are responding and reacting, which is why they're having, the proverbial kittens, because they can't control the narrative anymore. They're not able to control people's viewpoints, and the alternative media, whilst it has its flaws, and it most certainly does, it's also provided a lot of people with insight into the reality. And now people are starting to react in that way, but it is striking the balance, and that slightly concerns me. But thus far, people haven't reacted too hostilely the wrong way, but there is that real risk it could still happen.
Yeah, absolutely correct. Paul, thank you so much for being on. And
it's a pleasure.
The insights, man. It's definitely an absolute treat having you on twice this week. It was definitely good.
No, thank you. It was nice to, I don't take a lot of interest in politics, but I took an interest in the election just to see, for me, in a broad sense, what it means. So it was great to come on and have a good weekend, and everyone who's listening.
Definitely enjoy your weekend, and enjoy your weekend, everybody. Yep. We'll be back at 4 p.m. I think 12 p.m. we got Cuss with Gus, right, buddy?
Yes, 3 p.m. today.
3 p.m. we got Cuss with Gus. Heck, let's just do Cuss with Gus and go right into the. I'll make that the evening show. Heck, that. Let's just do that. Let's roll with it.
Excellent.
Awesome. All right, guys. See you all back at 3 p.m. Take care.
Cheers. Take